Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review the new episode of the Orville. And before I even watched it, someone wrote to me asking me if I wrote this episode because it has a lot of jokes which are very similar to the kind of stuff I used to do in my parody TNG edits. For those who don't know, I used to do recuts of Star Trek and using lines and scenes from the same actors from other movies and shows and remixing it all to create brand new stories with humoristic situations. And oftentimes I was showing gay relationships between members of the crew, like for example showing Data and Worf being in a relationship. And I always made the crew be all crazy and violent and always stabbing and killing each other constantly. And also always showing them going into the holodeck mostly to have sex there. And with more and more recuts I started showing them do more and more crazy and perverted stuff. For example, showing Picard do stuff with his holographic horse or getting chained up as part of some holodeck fantasy. And I used the special effects to make it look like the holodeck is all dirty from all the sex going inside it. All kinds of jokes like that. And so this episode of the Orville had a lot of similar ideas. It showed Bortus going into the holodeck, the simulator, to have sex and then getting more and more perverted each time he goes there. Like being chained up in prison and getting raped by the guard. And later in the episode he gets stabbed by his mate Clyden because it's kind of a Macklin divorce. It's all very similar to a lot of stuff I showed in my edits of Star Trek. Now obviously I'm not the only one who thought about all these ideas, and in fact I remember I used to read fan fiction years ago which also had a lot of similar things, like having gay relationships between characters, which I always found very funny for some reason. And of course I'm sure everybody thought about using the holodeck for sex. And it was never directly mentioned in Star Trek TNG, it was only implied. TNG was a very child-friendly show, so it never directly showed or implied sex. They only showed people kissing, and then the scene would fade to black, and the adult audience could guess what happened next, but the children watching wouldn't. And so it was the perfect all-family show, so parents could always watch it with their kids without feeling uncomfortable. Only in Deep Space Nine they started to directly state that people go into the holosuites to have sex. In TNG it was only implied. Like that one time Geordi fell in love with a woman there and kissed her, and later the real woman he was simulating found out about it, and then she replayed part of the simulation, and she immediately thought that Geordi is having sex with her inside the simulation, even though she never said that directly, but she said, "How dare you use me like this?" But all we ever saw is him kissing that simulation. And I think the most blatant example of holodeck porn was in the TNG episode Holo Pursuits, which probably mostly inspired this episode of the Orville. And in that episode Lieutenant Barclay was shown to have a holodeck addiction, and he was constantly going into the holodeck when off duty, and he was having sex with a simulation of Troy. And again, it was never shown directly, it was only implied. It basically only showed him kissing her, and then the scene would fade out. And that's the episode that probably inspired this Orville episode the most, because this was about Bortus getting addicted to the simulator, just like Barclay was addicted to the holodeck. Although Barclay was not just going there for sex, he was basically playing all kinds of funny simulations for entertainment, so it was never about porn addiction, it was only part of it. It was mostly about, I guess it would be more similar to being addicted to video games, because, you know, if we had the holodeck, of course we would want to go there because we can basically play anything we want inside, so it's far more than just about sex. He was also simulating people he knows from the ship, and he was basically abusing his bosses inside the holodeck, because in real life he was extremely shy and insecure guy, but in the holodeck he can do whatever he wants to do, so he was basically leading a fantasy life inside the holodeck when off duty. And being with Troy was just a small part of his fantasies. And yet here with Bortus it's basically only about the sex, and just like Barclay's fantasies eventually gets seen by the rest of the crew, causing him great embarrassment, the same thing happens with Bortus here. And Bortus getting embarrassed also reminds me of various Worf moments in TNG, in which Worf was embarrassed by something. For example, that episode in which Commander Korn was embarrassing him by being too polite to him, as if mocking his Klingon nature by behaving toward him like a human. And we could see that Worf is kind of embarrassed, but trying not to show it. So in short, all the things with Bortus in this episode were pretty funny, but it seemed to be like the same joke over and over again, maybe one too many times. And was it really necessary to show him fully nude and almost showing the full sexual act? This kind of stuff might make this show uncomfortable to watch as a family show. Unlike Star Trek, which parents could watch with their kids, this show might make that a bit uncomfortable with all this blatant sexuality, so that might be a problem for the show. The other plot of the episode was the Orville witnessing the destruction of a planet, which is also similar to a lot of TNG episodes in which they were witnessing such an event, like watching two planets colliding or a planet being destroyed by some anomaly. And as always, it turns out there's a humanoid population on the planet for them to save. But unlike Star Trek, there is no Prime Directive here, so there is no awkward scene of someone suggesting that they should just let all those people die. Although I think this was a missed opportunity to mock the Prime Directive a little bit, because it would have been nice if someone actually did say something like that, maybe Isaac, and then everybody else would call him out for that as being stupid and cruel, because how can a cultural contamination be worse for that culture than the entire culture going extinct? And this is one of my biggest criticisms of Star Trek, by the way, because all those times they didn't want to save various aliens from extinction, or having to violate Federation laws to do it, which did make the heroes look more heroic sometimes, since they were willing to risk their careers to do the right thing, but it also made the Federation look kind of evil. So I think this was a bit of a missed opportunity here to poke fun at the Prime Directive. Also, I love the fact they don't have transporters on the Orville and they are limited by the shuttles, because the transporters in Star Trek were often too easy of a solution, and they always had to make up excuses for why they can't use it in a situation, as not to have that easy solution, and it was getting annoying sometimes to constantly hear all those excuses for why they can't use the transporter, like, oh, there's an ion storm, so we can't use it, so we'll have to use the shuttle this time. Always the excuses like that. So I'm glad that in the Orville they just don't have the transporters at all, so they don't have to come up with excuses each time. So it's much better this way, and it makes situations like this much more challenging, with no need to constantly ask why can't they use the transporter, or to constantly have the transporter malfunctioning, which makes the ship look incompetent. Even though it could have worked in this episode, because they did show that the ship is malfunctioning all the time, which was a result of Bortus accidentally infecting the ship's computer with a virus because of the porn programs he used, which he bought from some nasty looking alien, and so they showed a lot of the ship's systems breaking down, which was a neat way to tie plot A and plot B together. And of course the ship malfunctions is also something that was done a lot of times on TNG. One time the Enterprise got infected by an Iconian virus, another time it was by nanites, and so on. And oftentimes it happened during a crisis, as a way to add tension to the episode by having the ship be in danger, because it can't simply fly away. So for example, they were witnessing some anomaly, some star which was going to explode, and just then the ship got infected by Wesley's nanites, and then they couldn't just move away, and they were in danger and on the clock to fix the situation so they can save the ship. So that was a neat way to add tension to the episode, by having the ship be in danger without the ability to simply fly away. And also all the little malfunctions on the ship can create funny situations, so we had similar stuff in this episode as well. And also we had the scene of Bortus and Isaac talking on the shuttle, which also reminded me of various moments between Data and Worf, since both of them don't understand humans. It was funny seeing their different perspectives about humanity, which was pretty comedic, so we have something similar here. And the Maklans are obviously inspired by the Klingons. That divorce scene of Klyden just stabbing Bortus, I think it was inspired by the Deep Space Nine episode Sons of Mog, in which Worf's brother Korn asks Worf to kill him, and Worf stabs him in the chest, and then Sisko has to decide what to do with Worf, since by Klingon laws he was not doing anything wrong. So we had a very similar scene here with Ed having to decide what to do with Bortus and Klyden, after Klyden stabbed Bortus, which is perfectly okay by Maklan law. So once again I have to say that this Orville episode felt like a mashup of a lot of ideas from Star Trek, and I have mixed feelings about this, because on the one hand it's showing me something I always thought would be funny to see on Star Trek, like seeing members of the crew using the holodeck to play out sex fantasies. On the other hand, it doesn't feel very original, and I feel it was done much better on Star Trek. For example, that Deep Space Nine episode in which Worf stabbed Kurn, that was so much more dramatic and tenseful, because it wasn't just played for a joke. And Sisko's reaction to it was much more powerful. And Captain Ed Mercer is really a pathetic character compared to all the captains in Star Trek. Ed is kind of a weak loser in comparison. Also, there is no real morality lesson here, unlike in Star Trek, which always explored all kinds of moral dilemmas of how to deal with a situation. Like that time in which Captain Picard had to decide whether or not to order Worf to donate his blood to a dying Romulan prisoner, because Worf refused to do it, and so Picard had to decide between the personal liberty of a member of his crew and the bigger picture of the situation. So that was an actual morality question he had to wrestle with. And Captain Sisko also had to face numerous difficult decisions It created much more drama and the situation itself was much more interesting. And we don't really have anything like that here, because Ed is kind of just a foolish character most of the time. He's not really a good leader, he's not a good captain, he's not any kind of role model or a teacher of morality. And I know he's supposed to be foolish to make it funny, but it's not that funny either most of the time, so I'm not sure it's worth it to have a character like that. I mean, if he was a totally incompetent fool, or if he was a nasty person, and if it was used to generate comedy, then I'd be fine with that. That's the kind of thing I did with Picard in my TNG recuts. Having him be either completely incompetent, or perverted, or evil, that was funny. But here they're trying to keep Ed as a good character, as a nice guy, and only occasionally make him say or do silly things, and it kind of makes his character inconsistent, and also he comes off just as a weak character most of the time. So I much prefer the way that Sisko handled that situation in Deep Space Nine, chewing out Worf in a powerful way, angrily shouting at him. That was a lot more entertaining than seeing Mercer politely explaining to Clyden that stabbing people is not okay, and then forgiving him for all of it right away. And so I think it's less good here than scenes like that in Star Trek. Also, I'm kind of getting tired of pointing out all the things that Orville is taking from Star Trek. It would be nice to see more original ideas that are not rip-offs. And season 1 of the Orville actually did have a lot of original ideas as well. And they were often in the same spirit and style of Star Trek, but they were still brand new ideas. And that's why I think a lot of people praise the show as being not just a parody of Star Trek, not just a spoof, but actually being like a brand new Star Trek, because it had new ideas as well. But so far in season 2 we didn't really see anything original, just recycled ideas, and I'd be fine with a remake of the same ideas if they were done better than originally. But I can't say that either, because I think the Barclay episode was much better and funnier and more interesting, because it wasn't just about sex. Barclay was playing out the whole range of fantasies and recreating the crew in the holodeck, and it was much more interesting. And so I have to say Star Trek TNG is still better show than the Orville, and of course it was a lot more original because that was the first show to do any of those ideas. And season 2 of the Orville so far does not feel original. It's still a very entertaining show and I love it, but I can't really call it great if it doesn't start delivering new original ideas and stories as well. Only then I'll be able to say this is truly a great show. So these are my thoughts about this episode. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.